big thank you to Pixo for, doing this with us. Website accessibility is, something that just a lot of folks don't know about and don't really know where to start with. So I think this is going to be a great place to just start. And I'm just, again, I can't thank you guys enough for, taking time out of your busy day to put on the website accessibility 101. So I'll let you guys go ahead and take it from here. And again, thank you so much. It means a lot. And thank you to everyone that has hopped on the Zoom call.
Well, thanks, Maggie. It's been a pleasure to partner with you. For those of you who may not be familiar with Pixo, we are a software consultancy in Urbana, and we create custom websites, software, and applications that address unique challenges. I'm Danielle. I'm the account executive at Pixo. I'm happy and honored to help facilitate today. And we're going to share lots of information. It's going to spark some questions. So get comfortable with potentially throwing things in the chat. You can introduce yourself now if you want to, so you can get used to using it. We love side conversations, but we also have a question and answer at the end as well. So if you do want to wait, you certainly can. I'm going to have Jenna introduce herself next.
Hey everyone, I'm Jenna. I'm the account coordinator at Pixo. So I'll be handling the details today. I'll be putting some helpful information into the chat for you. And as Danielle said, if you have questions that come up throughout Londi's presentation today, you're welcome to share those in the chat. I'll be sure to keep an eye on them for Londi so she can focus on her presentation, but we'll make sure that she can address them. If you would rather ask your question directly and come off mute, we are going to have time for a live Q&A at the end of the presentation today. And then lastly, if a question comes up after the webinar or you'd like to connect with Danielle and Londi after our time together today, you are welcome to reach out to us afterwards and we can schedule some time to chat. And as you probably heard as you entered the room, the nice voice telling you that we are recording the presentation today. Of course, we'll be able to have that. And I've already talked to Maggie about finding a way to share that with everyone afterwards and with anyone else that you think might find it helpful.
Thank you, Jenna. And last but not least, I'm going to turn over a main part of the event to Londi, our lead software engineer, to introduce herself and get started. But I do want Londi to start with why this topic is so important to her personally, because I feel like her story is just so wonderful. So take it away, Londi.
Thanks, Danielle. My name is Londi Naharo, and I've been at Pixo for a little over 9 years now. Accessibility is important to me because I've just been a part of different marginalized groups my whole life. And I've been, fighting to make things equitable for all those groups that I've touched that are important to me. I remember reading a book in 5th grade that teaches the American Sign Language alphabet and thinking, wow, what a cool way to communicate in this alternative way. And when I was a teenager, I actually taught children with disabilities how to defend themselves for years through martial arts. They were like between ages 3.5 and 12. And I took American Sign Language for a year in college. And then I had my first son, who is nonverbal and uses what is called an AAC device, an augmentative and alternative communication device to communicate. So he signs and uses this talker, and he's very slowly acquiring speech. So it's more important to me now than ever that my son gets the same opportunities as everybody else's, and to spread awareness of what some of those boundaries are that get in the way of that. And technology is really a big one. So yeah, this is something close to my heart and I really care about it. And yeah, that's what I do. So what is web accessibility and why does it matter? Web accessibility is the art of providing equal access and equal opportunity of web content to people with disabilities. Today, we're going to cover different types of disabilities, assistive technologies, compliance principles, tips, and tools and testing. As Danielle mentioned, there's a lot to cover here. Accessibility is a huge topic. So with some of this is going to be very high level, and then with a couple of other things, we'll go a little bit more in depth. But the goal is to make sure that your site is as accessible as possible to create an equitable experience for all users, regardless of their abilities. So there are 1 billion people on our planet today that have a disability. and that's 15% or 1 in 7. And people with disabilities are by far the largest minority group on the web. So what do people think about when they hear web accessibility? A lot of people think about blind users, but there are many other types of disabilities that we need to consider when thinking about accessibility. Here's a list of a bunch of different things that can affect someone's ability to digest information. So because there's so many different types of disabilities, there's also a lot of different ways to test if your site is accessible. Of course, we might have heard of screen readers that will read the content of your web page out loud to a blind user, but there are also people who, for example, cannot operate a mouse or cannot see really small text or can't differentiate between different colors. So when we build an accessible website, we're building it for people with disabilities, and that's true, but it also improves the overall user experience on your site for all users. Accessibility really is for everyone. Assistive technology, what is that? In a web context, it's assistive, adaptive, or rehabilitative devices that help people with disabilities navigate the web. So I'm going to show 3 examples of some assistive technologies, but there's so many more that we won't cover. Just know that most assistive technology will look like a keyboard input to your computer. So that's one of the reasons that testing for keyboard only will be a good indicator of how well other technologies will be able to access your web content. Okay, this is a user with a high contrast color-coded keyboard to make finding the keys they need easier. This user has limited vision. This is a sip and puff device, or an SNP, which uses air pressure controls. Depending on how they've configured it, they could use a puff of air to navigate to each element on your web page and a sip of air to activate a link or a button. This would be an example of a user with limited mobility. And this is one of my favorite ones. This is a keyboard with Braille input at the bottom. The pins come up and down when the user is over a line of text, so they can read that text in Braille. They can still type as we normally do with a standard keyboard, but they are able to read much more efficiently in Braille. Okay, so one of the things about the accessibility community is that any one of us can become a part of it at any time. Sometimes it's situational, and some examples of situational would be your mouse is broken, all you have is a keyboard. You fractured your wrist, you're using a mobile device, there's glare on your screen, you're feeling tired or unwell, you're in a noisy environment. Now that we all work from home, you might have kids and dogs in the background, or just having a long, stressful day and your cognitive abilities are, not as high as they normally would be. Sometimes it's not situational, sometimes it's permanent. But one thing we fail to realize is we take our abilities for granted. It's a powerful thing just to be able to put yourself in another's shoes and see how difficult they have it. ADA 508 and WCAG, oh my. So what are these different things? You might have heard all of them before. The ADA is the Americans with Disability Act, and it's a civil rights law prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities. It requires accessibility in all areas of your business, including physical spaces, hiring, and the digital space. And this was passed in 1990. Section 508 is the Rehabilitation Act, and it's a federal law that requires federal agencies to use information and tech that people with disabilities can access. It requires WCAG 2.0 AA compliance. And WCAG. WCAG is an internationally recognized standard for digital accessibility that was launched in 2008. It can be used to work toward 508 or ADA compliance. So I'm going to show a little bit more of what WCAG is. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Right now, the active WCAG is 2.1, but they're already working on 2.2. It's broken down into 4 principles, 13 guidelines, and 78 success criteria. And those criteria are further broken down into levels. So level A, level AA, and level AAA. So why not require AAA all the time if it's the strictest? Well, it's not recommended that level AAA conformance be required as a general policy because It's not possible to satisfy all levels of AAA success criteria for certain content. For example, one of the criteria is an 8th grade reading level, which you couldn't do for like a scientific journal article, for example. Another example in the physical space is not every entrance at your building can accommodate a ramp for like a wheelchair. But as long as you have one accessible entrance, then you're covered. Understanding WCAG can be very complex, especially when we get into the 78 success criteria. So we're going to look at the higher level 4 principles instead and get an idea of what's required for an equitable user experience. So these 4 principles are perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. That means that users must be able to perceive the information being presented. It can't be invisible to all of their senses. They have to perceive it in one form or another, whether it's sight, hearing, tactile, etc. The next one we have is operable. The user interface components and navigation must be operable. That means that the user must be able to operate the interface. It cannot be requiring an action that a user cannot perform. I think about drag and drop functionality. Well, if someone can't use a mouse, they can't really perform drag and drop. So there has to be an alternative method to make that operable for those people. So all functionality available from a keyboard only. The next one is understandable. So this is kind of related to that, 8th grade reading level type thing. The information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable. So they must understand the information as well as how to operate the user interface. It can't be beyond their understanding. We're not going to make people solve quadratic equations to get to the next piece of content. And then lastly, robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents and assistive technologies. It means when we're testing, your users should be able to access the content as technologies advance, as user agents evolve. Everybody should be able to access that content in one form or another. So it has to work with older versions, newer versions of assistive tech. And usually if you're making everything compatible with the keyboard, that will satisfy that as well. So how do we actually achieve compliance? There's a lot to consider when building an accessible website, and a good start would be, like I mentioned before, putting yourself in the shoes of somebody with various disabilities and making small changes with a little bit of reasoning. So not everybody has to be an engineer to start working on accessibility. For example, motor disabilities. Imagine that you can only use your voice to control the computer. Imagine you can move your arm pretty well, but not your hand and your fingers. Imagine that you have to use a joystick or another adaptive input as a mouse. Imagine you have no control of your arms or hands, and you're using a stick to control the computer or a sip and puff device. Ask yourself, does your site accommodate these scenarios? Cognitive disabilities. Imagine that you have trouble with one or more of the following: memorization, spelling, calculations, solving puzzles. Does your site accommodate these scenarios? Visual disabilities. Imagine that you can't tell certain colors apart. They look the same. Imagine you can read, but only at 400% magnification. Imagine you can't read, or you can't read comfortably and you use a screen reader instead. Does your site accommodate these scenarios? And visual is one of the tricky things. A lot of people don't really think about this, but if you do present something visually, you should always use at least 2 methods of doing so. So don't use, for example, red to indicate bad and green to indicate good, especially when red-green color blindness is one of the biggest color blindnesses out there. You want to use an additional layer. So whether that's shape or text or size, you want to use at least 2 methods to communicate something visually. So what if you need more help? Like we mentioned, accessibility isn't the simplest thing. So if you're thinking about it after your site is already built, it's even more challenging. It's harder to and more expensive to make changes after the site's already built. If you're building a new site, then you can think about accessibility early on in the design process, and that will save you a lot. So accessibility has 2 important concepts to consider when you're designing for your website, and that's structure and interactivity. We can eliminate many issues if we integrate accessibility early on when you're developing with these concepts in mind or designing with these concepts in mind. So what does that look like? Here's an example of what your process could look like if you're thinking about accessibility early on. You have the wireframe part of your project. You have the content strategy part of your project. Then we have what is going to be the landmark flowchart, which I'll definitely get into a little bit later. You have the HTML structure, the landmark sketch, and how do users actually interact with this? So this might be the UI part. Thinking about the wireframe and content to determine the importance and order and landmarks can help you decide what structure to use, and that will inform how a user is expecting to use the site. But I'll go into that a little bit more later on. So content flow. If you've ever written a paper for a literature class, it's basically like an outline. It'll show the different headings on your site and how they're nested together. And it dictates the flow of the application. So it's looking at the markup and saying, what am I encountering first? What am I encountering second? And it's literally telling you the order of that content. And you should get a nice little picture like what I have on the right. Your H2s are nested under your H1. Your H3s are nested under your H2s. And we don't have anything that's out of order. Oftentimes as content people, when you're adding content in, you're like, oh, that H4 looks really good. I like the style of it. Let me use an H4 here. That completely throws off the semantics for users with disabilities who are expecting to see things in a certain order. Pure CSS relies on content flow to some extent, and CSS, which is cascading style sheet, or what styles your website, it lacks a way to be completely independent of the order of the markup. So you can put things in a different order and then use CSS to make it appear in a readable content flow order, but that's highly discouraged. So WCAG recommends that your HTML order matches your visual order. So if a blind person, for example, is using a screen reader and they're following the source order, the HTML order of your page, and a sighted user is seeing that information presented visually in a different way, they might be confused when they encounter information in a different sequence. Another thing to consider is a visually impaired keyboard user relies on tab focus. So if you've ever used keyboard only, most browsers, when you tab to the next element, it'll put a little box around the element that you're currently viewing. So if the next thing that they tab to isn't in the same visual order as it is in the structural order, they can get lost of where they are on your page. And that can cause problems with assistive technology as well. So here's an example of our website and how our content order is. You'll see we have 2 H2s and 3 H3s, and these H3s are nested under the H2. So that relationship is pretty clear. The H2 is what we do, and the H3s are supporting examples of what we do. So that's an example of how you would order your content in a way that makes sense. So how do we think about content order? Well, designing for mobile first is one of the best ways of dictating what's most important about your content, because the most important things will be at top, and then everything else that's complementary will be toward the bottom. So if we design for mobile first, we can use that to decide where do our ARIA landmarks go. If we decide that we want to do a desktop first, we can say here are our ARIA landmarks, and then make sure that the site responds in a way that matches so that the most important landmarks are on top and the supporting content is below that. Either way is a good approach, but another benefit of doing mobile first is if you find color combinations and font size combinations that work for really small viewport widths or like mobile devices, then they're guaranteed to work at larger screen widths as well. So this is an example of 12-point sans serif font, and it's orange background with white text. When we look at WCAG guidelines, they say that large text is 14 point and bold, or 16 point. And I really want to highlight this because point is not the same as pixels. Oftentimes when we're in the software development world, we're building things in pixels, not point. And when people are designing things in certain programs, they're using point. And that does not translate one-to-one. So you might say, hey, I have 12 pixel font. This color combination works great, it's accessible. And then find out later, 12 pixels is really almost 15, or sorry, 12 point is almost 15 pixels. So, that's a conversion that you should think about when designing. But a good rule of thumb is if you design your color combinations and fonts with mobile in mind first and include those combinations on your style guide, this will also allow your QA department or quality assurance people to test these combinations before an engineer goes and implements that, and then you find out later that it's not accessible. So landmarks, you've heard me say ARIA landmarks maybe 30 times already in this presentation. I'm finally going to reveal what they are. Landmarks, just like the landmarks that you're familiar with in the physical world, help orient you to where you are in a town or city. ARIA landmarks help orient users to where they are on a web page. When you define parts of your page with these ARIA landmarks or ARIA roles, it allows screen reader users and keyboard users the ability to easily jump from one section to another on your website and know where they're going. So we have only a handful of landmarks. The ones with the asterisk are required, and you need to have at least one on every page, and that's banner, main, and content info. Some of these might make sense, like, hey, I know what navigation is, but what is a banner? What is a content info? What is a main? Well, if you've ever seen HTML before and everything looked like a little div tag, angle bracket div, close angle bracket, then you're probably using legacy HTML. HTML5 introduces many new elements. Several of them correspond directly to these ARIA attributes, these ARIA landmarks or roles. So here's the ARIA landmark that we talked about before, and here's what that means in HTML5. So a banner is really the header part of your website, which is the first thing that a user encounters. Usually it contains your main navigation, your search, your eyebrow menu, maybe like a big hero image. Navigation's navigation, main is main, so that's going to be the most of the body of your content. Content info is your footer. And the reason they call it content info is because that's usually where all the contact information is, or additional links, etc. Aside is complementary, section is region, article is article, form is form, but notice search does not have an HTML5 component. ARIA and HTML are not 5 or 1-to-1. So at this point, screen reader and other assistive technology is not strong enough to depend solely on your HTML5 tags. So use HTML5 wherever you can, but ARIA is that additional layer that in case you're using or trying to support older technology, this is kind of your fail-safe. How do you know when to use which tag where? Well, you can use like a decision tree or a flow chart, or ask yourself some questions. So is it a major navigation block? Then it's probably a nav tag. Can it stand on its own? Then it's probably an article. Is it required to understand the main content? If yes, it's main. If not, it's probably a side, etc. All right, so the second part, we talked about structure. The next part is interactivity. And that's because users expect to interact with your content in a certain way. For example, in this key, we have blue is spacebar, green is enter, purple is arrow, yellow is tab. If we're going through a navigation or one of those big mega menu navigations, I would expect to use the spacebar to toggle open an item, and then use the arrow key to get to all of its children items. And then I would expect to hit the enter key to take me to that link to go off to a new page. So users are expecting to interact with your content in a certain way. And if you are building something custom, you would really want to think about, well, how is the user going to interact with this? And what is the content I'm trying to present? What HTML makes the most sense? And based on that HTML, is this working the way that a normal menu would work? Is this working the way a normal form would work? Do I expect to hit enter and submit the form? You need to ask yourself those questions to make sure that whatever you're building is still following the expectations of what your users are used to. And that was a small example. There are plenty of web components out there, plenty of different ways to interact with them. So ARIA overlay or landmark sketch. We've already talked about what those different landmarks are. Here's an example where this red area is the banner. This blue area is the main. And then we have two sidebars that are complementary and content info. So what the landmark sketch does is we just take a printout of the wireframe or the design, and we label it, we annotate it with where are the different ARIA pieces that we need to make sure exist and what's appropriate to wrap around this content. You can go overboard. You don't need 30 articles on your page. You don't necessarily need to have different sections unless you have like a really, really long page of content, and then it's easier for people to jump around. But this at least helps get everybody on the same page so that we know what's important, what's grouped together, and how is this supposed to be presented to the users. So now one of my favorite parts, tools and testing. If you already have a website and you need to see if it's compliant, you can use a variety of tools to test and see what accessibility issues might exist. So we'll look at some of the tools that we use here at Pixo, but there are so many out there. The first one is FAE, which stands for Functional Accessibility Evaluator. And it was created by the folks at DRES at the U of I, that's Disability Resources and Educational Services. And what's great about this tool is it's a crawler, meaning you enter in one URL and it'll go and find all the subpages and it'll test all of those pages and build a nice little report for you. It breaks that report down into rule groups or rule categories. And then if you drill into that, it'll tell you which WCAG guidelines that relates to. And then it'll even tell you what the rule scope is and how to possibly address some of those issues. So I'm going to show you the latest report for the Pixo site. This is our homepage. So I'm going to the forms error. There are two. And then I'm going to this violation. And I click on one of the pages that has this violation. And if I scroll down, I'll see, hey, it's input email. If I go through to the details, because right now I'm on the element, it'll tell me WCAG success criteria 3.32, 1.31, 2.46. So it'll tell you what the violation relates to, and it'll say, here are some preferred techniques on how to address these issues. So that can be super useful. The next tool might look really, really similar because it's built by the same exact people that make FAE. It's called A-Inspector, and it's a plugin that only works for Firefox at this moment. And the difference between FAE and A-Inspector is A-Inspector will test a single web page. So typically what we would do is we'd run our site through the crawler through FAE, and then we would double check on that page to see, is this an actual violation? Is it a warning? Is it a manual check? Is it a pass? Is it a false positive? So we use this to do more in-depth testing. I have a little video of that as well. You have to make sure that your Firefox is up to date and your plugins are up to date. I did not do that when I recorded this video, so the little part on the left is not going to work fully, but I do want to draw your attention to when I enable the plugin, it will drop us down directly to that one violation and put a little box around it with an indicator that, hey, this is the violation. Usually when you click on that, it'll give you that same information as an FAE that says, here's the violation, here's the WCAG guidelines that it's not conforming to, and here's some just suggestions on how to fix that. So here's what that looks like, the same report. We open it in Firefox, I toggle on the A-Inspector, and it drops us down to that same email tag that was throwing the error originally. This usually is filled out with data, so sorry about that. The next tool is Colorable, which is something that you can use in the design phase. Colorable will check color contrast ratios for different foreground and background combinations, and it'll tell you if you pass the content threshold for which level of WCAG and at what font size. So it also has these nice sliders down here so that if your color combination is not accessible, you can slide and change the values, tweak them slightly to find the color combination that will work. So if you're familiar with this format, this is hexadecimal colors, and you can inspect your web page and grab those hexadecimal colors straight from the CSS, which is what my video will show. If you're not, there are plenty of other plugins that can give you like a little eyedropper tool, so you can just select a color and copy that hexadecimal value directly and paste it into Colorable. So again, this is on the Pixo website. I thought, hey, this light blue on this dark blue, I'm not convinced that that's accessible. I actually really did this because I was like, that does not look accessible to me. So I inspect the element and I grab the color, the foreground color, and paste that into Colorable. And then I go get the background color and I paste that in. And to my delight, it's accessible. That's great. And it'll tell you it's accessible for WCAG AA, and the ratio is 5.42. It's 3.1 for large text and 4 point something for large text. So we're above that threshold, which is great. The next tool, if you remember me talking about the lovely folks at DRES that did FAE and A-Inspector, this was something that I developed with them. It's called accessibility bookmarklets. And a bookmarklet is just a snippet of JavaScript that can run in every browser. So I have a video here that will show you how to install that. And Jenna will be sharing these links. You drag it up into your favorites bar or bookmarklets bar. You click on it and it'll activate the JavaScript that'll create a nice little overlay over your page to show you what the accessibility features are. It's not an evaluation tool. It's just a different way to make hidden accessibility features visible. So it is a visualization tool. So keep that in mind. Do not use this to see if your site is compliant, but it helps with, communication between what you don't see and what you see, bridges that gap. So here's our accessibility bookmarklets website, and I'll show how you install it and use it. You drag it up. And then you go to whatever web page you want to test. And then you click it. And boom, you'll see that nice little overlay. It's called an overlay because it lays on top of your content and will label out what those different features are. And if you hover over that label, you'll get additional information. So for example, if I use the image bookmarklet, it'll tell me what type of image it is, where it gets its alternative text from, and what the accessibility name is, or what the accessible name is. So that's what a screen reader will encounter when they get to that image. All right. And the last tool that I have on our list is screen readers. There are a ton of free screen readers, and some of them are for certain systems, like this is Apple VoiceOver, this is Windows NVDA, this is Linux Orca. And then we have some that are just browser extensions, and this one's Chromevox. So again, that would only work for Chrome. If you were using a different browser, you'd have to find a different tool. And then I have a little video of me using VoiceOver on the Pixo website homepage. And I will tell you that this is normal speed. This is one of the voices that I like to listen to when testing, but it can be overwhelming. And people that use these technologies every day listen to it way faster than what you're going to hear right now. And all I'm doing is tabbing through the site. So you'll notice that it's kind of jumping from button to link to button to link. There are other hotkeys or little keyboard shortcuts that you interact with in different ways. So I could jump to different landmarks on the page. I could just have it start reading from wherever I'm at down the page. I just chose to show what this looks like when you tab through it. So here goes nothing.
Welcome to VoiceOver. VoiceOver speaks descriptions of items on the screen and can be used to control the computer using only your keyboard.
Is that audio coming through?
Chrome, banner, visited, link, image, Pixo, list 6 items, link, approach, link, work, link, people, link, jobs, link, contact, visited, link, log, visit other bookmarks, menu pop, Pixo, link, visited, link. Let's talk about your project. Main. You are currently on a link. To link. Multi-site platform for the U of I College of Fine and Applied Arts. Link. International web platform for precision planting. Link. Bibliography database for ASCE. Link. Building with SIP. Link. Drawing tote visited. Link. Behavior-driven development. Link. Object-oriented UX. Visited. Link. Link. Customizing the author experience in WordPress. Visited. Link. Striking a balance between your values and your benefits. Link. Explore all blog posts. Link. Learn more about working at Pixo. Link. Software developer. Link. Introduce yourself. Hi, my name is Edit Text. You are currently on a text field. Starting a project because edit text. Main. You are currently on edit text email. Blank. Your phone number. Menu pop up. Submit button. Group. You are current. Stop recording button. You are currently on a button.
That was me trying to exit VoiceOver at the end there. But yeah, it goes pretty fast and it gives tons of different information. And not every screen reader is going to sound the same. So we like to test with, the most popular ones. See. So caveats, not all testing tools are created equal. All of these tools are implementation of some human's understanding of the guidelines, which means not everybody's going to interpret them the same way, and not all the tools are going to find the same bugs. But remember, it's not to fix 100% of the bugs on your site. The goal is to make sure that your site is as accessible as possible to create an equitable experience for all users, regardless of their abilities. So we might test a site and find no bugs with FAE, A-Inspector, our screen reader, and Colorable. And then you might test it in something like Wave Toolbar, and it might find 2 or 3 things that we've either said this is a false positive, or it's the tools are limited because they can't really evaluate something that complex. And you'll have a lot of manual checks. A lot of these testing tools are just a quick check. And in order to get a true understanding of how accessible your site is, there will be a lot of manual testing. These tools do not replace a human. They just make the human's job a little bit easier. So yeah, we at Pixo have been in the accessibility space for over a decade, and we're constantly adapting as technology evolves. If you need additional information or help bringing your site to compliance or even testing it in the first place, we offer tons of different support like audits, recommendations for fixes, quotes for the actual fixes, depending on what your site's built in, a list of testing tools, content strategy, and sitemap help. So if you're interested in any of these services for your website, you can reach out to Danielle. Her email's right there on that slide, and Jenna will also be sharing that. And just want to say a big thank you to Maggie for setting us up.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
A lot of information and good information, Londi, and awareness is, the first step. When I first started working at Pixo, it's only been a year and a half. I've been with the crew. I only really thought of accessibility in physical space. And so just even learning about this for me was helpful. I was curious, I didn't see anything come through on the chat, but if anybody had any questions for Londi.
Did I confuse anybody even more than before they started the webinar? No, that's good. Thank you, Krista.
Yeah, thank you, Krista.
I have a
Awesome.
question.
Yes.
What's your opinion of the plugins that you can add to sites to make them more accessible? I'm thinking of like sites that tend to have the little circles on them that you can click and sort of choose the accessibility add-ons you want included.
Yeah, we've actually seen some sites like that that are really cool because they give you a menu of things that you can enable. I would say that there are some limitations to those. For example, if you've ever heard of dark mode, a lot of people's idea of dark mode is let's just invert the colors. And that doesn't necessarily make it easier for users with limited vision to see. So a lot of these plugins have very good intentions, and I've not had a chance to play with a bunch of them to see how well they actually do. But some of them, their hearts are in the right place and they have really good ideas. I just don't know any specifics.
And my second question, the tools for testing sites that you featured, are those free to use or do you need to pay to use them?
All of them are free except for FAE, the Functional Accessibility Evaluator. There is a free tier, but you are limited to 25 pages. So if you have a really, really small site, you're good. If not, they do offer like a tiered pricing for how in-depth they can crawl your site.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Of course. Anyone else? Don't be shy.
And I know sometimes it's hard to unmute yourself and ask those questions right now. And we are certainly happy to take questions afterwards too if they pop up after we end the call today, because we know there's a lot to digest. And some people don't want to talk specifics about their website while being recorded. And I understand that too. So we can certainly wait and we can stop the recording. If anybody does want to hang out and hang around for more questions, we can certainly do that as well. Maggie, any other last words before we say farewell?
I think it was a fabulous training. Thank you so much. I learned so much. I wish you could see my all my notes right now. So I'm gonna go back and watch this again, just so I can kind of digest everything. But I think it was a great place to start for a lot of us that didn't have a lot of knowledge about website accessibility. So again, I can't thank you guys enough for this. It means the world. And I know we had quite a few people come on the call today, which is great. So I am excited to keep in touch with you. And again, everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Pixo, okay?
Thank you so much for everybody for being here. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.